$500 million. The words rang out like a gunshot inside the marble chamber of the courtroom. For a moment, everything froze. The click of cameras halted mid-press, journalists' pens stopped scratching, and even the murmurs of attorneys died on their lips. A number so outrageous it seemed almost surreal, $500 million, levied against a sitting congresswoman, Jasmine Crockett. The judge, Thomas, leaned back in his chair with a look of cold satisfaction, as though he had just delivered the final blow in a duel. Around him, whispers began to ripple through the gallery. Did he really say 500 million? This can't be real. How is that even legal? Some gasped, others laughed nervously, and a few shook their heads in disbelief. It wasn't just a fine, it was a declaration of war. For the cameras trained on the congresswoman, it was the image of the century. Flashes exploded in bursts, trying to capture the exact second when the weight of that number should have broken her. Political rivals were already drafting their statements, lobbyists smirking at the downfall, and Judge Thomas himself straightened his robe like a king sealing a sentence. To many, it looked like the end of Jasmine Crockett's career, maybe even her life's work. And yet, she did not flinch. No tears, no outrage, no trembling hands. Just silence, as she sat tall, her eyes fixed on the man behind the bench. That silence became heavier than the fine itself, pressing against the walls, daring anyone to breathe too loud. The villain had made his move, but the hero did not play his script. Instead, Crockett's composure carved through the tension like a blade. The whispers grew into disbelief. Why isn't she reacting? Does she know something we don't? Judge Thomas adjusted his glasses, suddenly uncomfortable beneath her gaze. Reporters leaned forward, sensing that the story was no longer what he had done, but what she would do next. Because what nobody in that courtroom, not even Judge Thomas himself, could predict was how Jasmine Crockett would take that $500 million blow and turn the entire court, the entire narrative, and the entire country against him. And it began in the very next breath. The number wasn't just staggering, it was historic. Never before in American history had a sitting congresswoman been ordered to pay such an astronomical fine. $500 million wasn't a penalty, it was a guillotine. And everyone in the chamber knew it. This wasn't about damages, restitution, or justice. This was about sending a message: speak too loudly, challenge the wrong interests, and you will be crushed. For Jasmine Crockett, the fine wasn't simply an attack on her bank account, it was an attempt to erase her voice. To silence dissent with the sharpest weapon the system could conjure: fear. If a judge could bankrupt a congresswoman for standing her ground, what chance did ordinary citizens have? What chance did activists, immigrants, or single mothers have against the machinery of unchecked power? At the center of that machinery stood Judge Thomas. To many, he wasn't just a man in robes, he was a shadow that loomed over politics and law for decades. His rulings had bent in favor of corporate titans, silenced community challengers, and carved loopholes for those who already had the most. Politicians whispered his name with both reverence and fear. Some called him untouchable. Others, corrupt. But all knew, when Thomas wanted someone silenced, their downfall was swift and merciless. And now, Jasmine Crockett stood as his newest target. In the gallery, the narrative was already being written. Commentators imagined headlines: Crockett crushed by historic fine. Judge Thomas delivers legal earthquake. Donors whispered about pulling support. Rivals whispered about her career being finished. The story wasn't just about a courtroom, it was about America watching an underdog face a giant. But here was the twist: Crockett knew the stakes were bigger than herself. Every camera lens might have been aimed at her face, but in her mind, she carried the weight of millions: every voice that had been told to stay quiet, every immigrant who had been told to go back, every woman who had been told to sit down. Her fight in that courtroom wasn't about protecting her reputation or even her political seat, it was about exposing the rot within the system itself. Judge Thomas thought he had delivered a final blow. But in truth, he had overplayed his hand. By striking her with such an outrageous punishment, he revealed the very arrogance he had always tried to conceal. And Crockett, sitting in silence, understood that power wasn't measured by the gavel's slam, nor by the dollar signs attached to a fine. Power came from the people watching, listening, and deciding whose side they were on. This wasn't just about money. This was about power, and who truly held it. The cameras caught the glint in her eyes, a quiet defiance that unsettled the very man who had declared her defeat. Reporters didn't realize it yet, but they were no longer documenting the fall of a congresswoman. They were witnessing the birth of a battle that would ignite the country. And the first spark was about to strike. For decades, Judge Thomas had worn the black robe not as a symbol of justice, but as armor. In the quiet halls of America's courts, where the gavel's echo was supposed to signal fairness, his rulings often carried a different weight, one that tilted toward the powerful, the well-connected, the untouchable. He was the kind of figure whispered about in law schools and political circles alike, brilliant, yes, but dangerously biased. A man whose interpretation of the law seemed to bend, over and over again, in the direction of those who already had everything. To some, he was a guardian of the status quo. To others, he was the very embodiment of corruption hidden in plain sight. But to Thomas himself, he was untouchable. There was a pattern, clear as day to anyone who dared to trace it. Corporate polluters walked free after his rulings, while the communities they poisoned were left with nothing. Whistleblowers who tried to expose government contracts suddenly found themselves discredited by his carefully worded opinions. And when civil rights groups brought forward cases of discrimination, Thomas's decisions often read like a lecture in restraint, couched in the language of neutrality but soaked in the undertone of dismissal. Every ruling fed his legend, not of fairness, but of fear. Attorneys learned how to read his body language, the slight smirk when a defendant was outmatched, the sharp glare when a young lawyer tried to press too hard. He wielded silence like a weapon, waiting until the tension in the courtroom grew unbearable before delivering his verdict. And always, the verdict fell heavy on those who could least afford it. His rise had been paved with favors and alliances. Politicians who needed a shield from accountability found it in Thomas's chambers. Business magnates with billions at stake often emerged from his courtroom with smiles of relief. In return, Thomas's power only grew. Invitations flowed, private retreats with the elite, exclusive dinners where policy and profit mingled in hushed conversations. For him, it was validation, proof that he belonged not with the people, but above them. For decades, Thomas sat above the law, or so he believed. That belief had hardened into arrogance. He carried himself like a monarch cloaked in legal language, convinced that the robe he wore rendered him untouchable. And to be fair, history had given him every reason to think so. Challenges to his rulings were crushed. Criticism bounced off him like rain on stone. Scandals that might have sunk another man dissolved into the fog of political distraction. But arrogance, like rust, eats from the inside. The more victories he amassed, the less careful he became. What once looked like strategy soon resembled indulgence. His written opinions grew more scathing, laced with personal barbs rather than impartial analysis. He dismissed not only lawyers but entire communities with a wave of his pen, as though the struggles of millions were merely footnotes in his personal legacy. And yet, through it all, he believed himself invincible. When Jasmine Crockett walked into his courtroom, Thomas didn't see her as a congresswoman, or even as an equal combatant. He saw her as a target. A symbol of the new America he resisted, young, unapologetic, unafraid to call out hypocrisy. In his mind, she wasn't just an opponent, she was a disruption to the order he had spent a lifetime protecting. And disruptions, in Thomas's world, were to be silenced. The $500 million fine wasn't born from law, it was born from ego. It was Thomas staking his claim, flexing his power, daring anyone to question it. He wanted her crushed not just financially, but symbolically. He wanted America to see that no matter how high you rose, one stroke of his pen could bring you to your knees. But in delivering that punishment, Thomas revealed more than he intended. He revealed his own fear, the fear that voices like Crockett's were gaining ground, that the America he had ruled from the shadows was shifting. And fear, for all its bluster, leaves cracks in even the strongest facade. The cameras may have captured Crockett's shock, but they also captured something else: the smugness in Thomas's smile, the unmistakable arrogance of a man who believed he had written the final chapter. He didn't know it yet, but that expression would become his undoing. Because arrogance is blinding. And while Thomas sat on his throne of rulings and favors, he failed to see that every empire of unchecked power eventually meets the same fate. His overconfidence had set the stage. His downfall was already in motion. And Jasmine Crockett was about to light the fuse. Jasmine Crockett did not step into that courtroom as a politician defined only by titles and headlines. She entered as the product of a story rooted far deeper, one born in struggle, sharpened by resistance, and carried forward by an unshakable belief that dignity could not be silenced. Her rise was not polished, not paved with the comforts that so many in power took for granted. It was carved out of long nights, unpaid bills, and the constant reminder that the world rarely makes room for voices like hers. She was raised in a neighborhood where the system's failures weren't just statistics, they were lived realities. Schools underfunded. Hospitals understaffed. Dreams cut short not because of lack of talent, but because of lack of opportunity. Jasmine saw all of it. She saw the mothers juggling 2, 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. She saw fathers swallowed whole by a criminal justice system that seemed built to break them. And she saw children, bright-eyed, brimming with potential, taught too early that their voices didn't matter. But Jasmine refused to accept silence as her inheritance. Even as a child, she had a way of speaking up when others stayed quiet. Teachers described her as stubborn, though she preferred the word unmovable. She was the girl who refused to let a question go unanswered, the one who challenged unfair rules, who dared to ask why when others muttered, "That's just the way it is." That spirit followed her into adulthood, fueling a career not built for comfort but for confrontation. Her journey into law was less a career choice than a calling. In law school, she didn't just memorize case law, she dissected it, exposed its blind spots, and pointed out the ways it failed those who most needed its protection. She interned at offices where underpaid public defenders fought for clients who had no one else in their corner. She watched colleagues burn out from the impossible caseloads, but instead of breaking, she absorbed the lessons. The system doesn't bend easily, but when it does, it bends because someone pushed until their hands bled. By the time Jasmine Crockett entered public life, she had already built a reputation as someone who would not flinch. She was known for standing her ground in legislative debates, for refusing to let her voice be drowned out in rooms where compromise meant capitulation. She wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a fighter whose every word carried the weight of those who had been told to sit down and stay quiet. And yet, her grit was never reckless. It was sharpened by strategy, by years of learning when to strike hard and when to wait. In courtroom battles, she had a gift for turning disadvantage into strength. Once, when opposing counsel tried to dismiss her as inexperienced, she let the insult hang in the air, unchallenged, until she delivered a closing argument so precise, so devastating, that the jury turned not only against her opponent's case but against his arrogance. In that moment, Jasmine had learned something vital: underestimation was her most powerful weapon. Every setback in her life, every attempt to silence her, had prepared her for moments exactly like the one she now faced with Judge Thomas. She knew what it meant to be cornered, and she knew how to turn that corner into a stage. She understood that the courtroom wasn't just about legal language, it was theater, power, and psychology. And no one understood the stakes better than she did, because she had lived them. She carried not just her name into that courtroom, but the weight of every silenced voice in America. That weight could have crushed her. For many, it would have. But for Jasmine, it became fuel. It reminded her that every time she stood her ground, she wasn't standing for herself alone, she was standing for the mothers who never had their day in court, for the workers cheated out of wages, for the families displaced by policies signed in rooms they were never invited into. Her rise was never about ambition for ambition's sake. It was about justice. It was about rewriting a narrative that had too often been written without people like her in mind. And that's what made her different from Thomas. For him, the law was a tool to protect power. For her, the law was a weapon to defend the powerless. Their collision was inevitable. The media had always framed her as fiery, unpredictable, unafraid of confrontation. But those who knew her best understood that her courage came not from spectacle but from scars. Every battle she'd fought, every time she was underestimated, dismissed, attacked, became another layer of armor. And in the courtroom where Thomas tried to bury her beneath $500 million of punishment, it wasn't just armor she carried. It was fire. Her background had not just prepared her for this moment, it had designed her for it. The very things Thomas thought made her weak, her youth, her bluntness, her refusal to bow, were the qualities that turned her into his most dangerous opponent. Because Jasmine Crockett had built her life in the shadows of systems that told her no, and every no had taught her how to make a louder yes. Thomas thought the fine would end her career. He believed it would strip her of resources, reputation, and resolve. But he didn't understand her history. He didn't understand that she had faced far worse with far less. He didn't understand that the courtroom he sought to weaponize against her would soon become the very place where his own power unraveled. For Jasmine, the verdict wasn't an ending. It was a spark. And when the world looked at her and saw defeat, she was already preparing the counterstrike. Because the fight with Judge Thomas wasn't just about money. It wasn't even just about her. It was about proving, once and for all, that the silence could rise, and when they did, the walls of power would shake. The gavel struck with a force that seemed to echo beyond the wood-paneled courtroom, reverberating into the chests of everyone present. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, the weight of the $500 million fine still hanging thick in the air like a storm cloud no one could escape. He didn't merely issue the fine, he treated it like a performance, a carefully crafted spectacle. This, he boomed, tapping the papers in front of him, is not just a judgment. It is a lesson. A warning. A reminder that arrogance before the bench will not be tolerated, not by this court, not by this judge. His voice rolled heavy, dripping with disdain. Cameras clicked furiously, each flash capturing his sneer. Reporters scribbled, jurors shifted uncomfortably, and the gallery leaned forward, unsure whether they were watching justice or theater. Thomas basked in it. For years, he had dominated rooms like this one. He thrived on spectacle, feeding on the silence of those too intimidated to challenge him. But this time, the silence wasn't surrender. It was Jasmine Crockett. She sat at her table, hands folded neatly, back straight, eyes unflinching. No frantic scribbling of notes, no whispered strategy to her legal team. Just quiet. A quiet so steady it began to bend the atmosphere in the room. Thomas continued, relishing the performance. $500 million, he said slowly, savoring each syllable. A number chosen not at random, but as a reflection of the magnitude of your defiance. You think the law bends to passion, to noise, to political theater? No, Ms. Crockett. The law bends to authority. And today, you will learn who holds that authority. Gasps flickered through the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded as if hypnotized by his dominance. The balance of power seemed painfully clear. Thomas was the mountain, and Crockett was the climber with no rope. And yet, her silence persisted. Seconds passed. Long, heavy seconds that stretched into something more than waiting. Thomas's words, sharp as they were, began to lose their edge in the face of her calm. Like a boxer punching into the void, he found himself growing louder, angrier, searching for the reaction that refused to come. Do you have nothing to say? He pressed, his voice tightening. Do you truly believe you can sit there, mute, while this court defines your fate? Do you think your silence makes you strong? Jasmine blinked, slowly. Still no words. A murmur rippled through the audience. What was she doing? Why wasn't she fighting back? Some whispered that maybe the weight had finally crushed her. Others leaned forward, recognizing something deliberate in the stillness. Thomas mistook it for weakness. And in that miscalculation, the first cracks appeared. His lecture turned into a rant. He repeated himself. He shifted in his chair. He slammed his gavel again, this time harder, the sound a little too desperate. "This fine," he barked, "is a warning shot to anyone who believes they can challenge the sanctity of this court. Do you understand?" Still, Jasmine sat. Calm. Measured. Eyes locked on him, not as a defendant cornered, but as a woman studying her opponent, waiting for his energy to burn itself out. The silence was no longer empty, it was powerful. It was a mirror, forcing Thomas to see his own arrogance reflected back at him. The more he talked, the smaller he seemed. And the quieter she remained, the louder her presence grew. By now, even the reporters had paused their scribbling. They were transfixed, sensing the shift. The performance wasn't Thomas's anymore. The audience wasn't watching his show, they were watching hers. Finally, the tension became unbearable. The judge leaned over the bench, pointing at her with an almost trembling hand. "Speak. Defend yourself if you can. Or sit there and prove my point, that you are nothing without the stage you cling to." The room held its breath. And then, Jasmine Crockett moved. She leaned forward, her chair creaking softly in the hushed courtroom. Her voice, when it finally came, was calm, steady, and devastatingly sharp. "Your Honor," she said, each word deliberate, "the only stage here is the one you built for yourself." The words sliced through the air. Gasps erupted, pens flew back into motion, and even Thomas froze, his armor punctured by the quiet precision of her reply. For the first time, it wasn't clear who held the power. And the battle had only just begun. The silence after Crockett's first line hung like a blade suspended midair. Judge Thomas shifted, his robe seeming suddenly heavier on his shoulders. For the first time that day, the courtroom's eyes weren't glued to him, they were fixed on her. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, steady and deliberate, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment. "Your Honor," she began, her tone respectful but edged with unshakable resolve, "you call this a lesson. But if we're truly here to learn, then let us start with history. Because the very precedent of this court, your court, has been weaponized not for justice, but for spectacle." Gasps scattered through the benches. A few reporters' pens scratched furiously, recognizing the spark of a story that was no longer about a fine, but about power itself. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Careful, Ms. Crockett," he warned. She ignored the threat. Calmly, she opened a folder, sliding out documents she had brought, not in panic, not in desperation, but with surgical timing. She held the first paper up just long enough for the cameras to catch. United States vs. Turner, 1997. A case where the defendant, a corporation backed by your donors, was fined a fraction of what you just leveled against me, despite documented fraud costing taxpayers billions. Billions, Judge Thomas. And yet their fine amounted to less than 1% of what you've charged a sitting congresswoman for speaking her mind. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Murmurs buzzed like static, heads turning toward one another in disbelief. Thomas shifted in his seat. "This is irrelevant." On the contrary, Crockett cut in, her voice slicing through his interruption, "It is entirely relevant. You call my words defiance. I call them accountability. And the precedent is clear, when your allies are guilty, you shield them. When your critics speak, you crush them." Reporters were scribbling so quickly the scratching of pens became a soundtrack to the moment. One by one, jurors glanced at each other, their expressions no longer neutral. The courtroom, once his stage, had tilted. She laid the next sheet down with a sharp flick. United States vs. Morales, 2004. A young immigrant activist fined beyond his means for peaceful protest. The judge who signed that decision? You. The attorney who represented the corporate interest on the other side? A man who later became your benefactor. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences have patterns. And this pattern, Your Honor, is one you cannot silence. Thomas's face flushed crimson. He slammed his gavel once, twice, the sound frantic. "Order!" This is my court. But even as the wood cracked against the block, the courtroom did not quiet. The murmurs rose louder, swelling into something uncontainable. For the first time, his gavel sounded less like authority and more like desperation. Crockett didn't flinch. She let the noise play, allowed the tension to rise, then raised her voice only slightly, just enough that the room bent back toward her. You see, Judge Thomas, the problem with building a throne of paper is that receipts burn hot. And I've brought more than a few. Laughter erupted in the gallery, brief, nervous, but real. A flash of humanity that broke the rigid decorum Thomas had clung to. He looked out at the crowd, startled, realizing control was slipping like water through his fists. Piece by piece, Crockett delivered her blows. Each citation wasn't just a case, it was a story: families bankrupted, activists silenced, corporations enriched. And with every document she unveiled, she tethered Thomas to them. Not abstract rulings. Not distant history. But lives ruined by his pen. The tension became unbearable. The reporters could hardly keep up, typing feverishly, eyes darting between Crockett's calm composure and Thomas's unraveling rage. Cameras flashed with an urgency that made the courtroom feel less like a trial and more like the climax of a national drama. Thomas's voice broke with anger. This is outrageous. You have no standing to accuse this court. She cut him again, her tone still steady, unshaken. I am not accusing the court. I am holding you accountable. And the distinction matters, Judge, because this courtroom is not yours. It belongs to the people. And they deserve to see who has been sitting in judgment over them. Gasps, louder now, rose like a wave. For the first time, Thomas recoiled. His hand, once firm on the gavel, trembled slightly. Crockett paused, deliberately letting the silence swell. She scanned the room, jurors, reporters, even the bailiff seemed suspended in the gravity of her words. Then she delivered the line that would echo far beyond those walls. You fine me $500 million as if I am the problem. But tell me, Judge Thomas, how many millions have you cost this nation by selling your verdicts to the highest bidder? The air split open. Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into shouts. The gallery erupted in disbelief and fury, not at her, but at him. People rose to their feet, some clapping, others shouting, all of them sensing the tide had turned. Thomas pounded the gavel so hard it nearly splintered. Sit down. Sit down or I'll clear this courtroom. His voice cracked, the mask of control shattered. He no longer looked like the omnipotent judge. He looked cornered. And Crockett? She remained seated. Poised. Calm. The eye of the storm she had summoned. She didn't need to raise her voice anymore, the crowd was doing it for her. She leaned back slightly, almost serene, letting the chaos swirl around Thomas. And with one final strike, she sealed the moment. By the end, Your Honor, it isn't me on trial. It's you. The words dropped like a hammer, reverberating through every heart in the room. For a long second, time froze, reporters' pens paused midair, the gallery held its breath, and even Thomas stopped pounding his gavel. And then, like thunder after lightning, the room erupted once more. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail, cameras flashed in a frenzy, and jurors stared in stunned silence at the man who suddenly looked less like a judge and more like a defendant. In that moment, the story of the trial transformed. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was pulling back the curtain on a man who had ruled unchallenged for decades. The power he wielded so arrogantly was crumbling, not under the weight of protest or noise, but under the precision of her composure, her receipts, her truth. By the end of that day, no one would remember the number $500 million. What they would remember was the shift, the instant when Jasmine Crockett flipped the trial on its head and turned Judge Thomas from untouchable authority into a man finally forced to face his own record. And for the first time in his long career, Clarence Thomas realized the gavel in his hand was no longer enough to silence the storm. The moment Jasmine Crockett dropped her final line, by the end, it wasn't me on trial. It was you. The courtroom itself had barely settled when the outside world ignited. Within minutes, snippets of her takedown were uploaded, clipped, and launched into the endless current of the internet. By the time Crockett walked out of the courthouse, her name was no longer just trending. It was a global phenomenon. Hashtag Crockett wins. Hashtag Thomas exposed. Hashtag mic drop moment. On Twitter, now X, the hashtags cascaded into trending lists across continents. In New York, Los Angeles, London, Johannesburg, New Delhi, Sydney, feeds flooded with clips of her poised composure, juxtaposed with Judge Thomas's unraveling fury. One viral tweet simply read, "We came for a trial. We stayed for the demolition of a Supreme Court ego." Hashtag Crockett wins. On TikTok, the edits rolled in with dizzying speed. Slow-motion replays of Crockett dropping the stack of legal receipts were set to dramatic soundtracks, the Inception Brom, Kendrick Lamar's Humble, even the Mortal Kombat Finish Him voiceover. Teens who had never watched C-SPAN in their lives were suddenly lip-syncing her final line as if it were a line from a blockbuster. Instagram reels flooded with memes, Thomas's face edited onto a crumbling statue, Crockett depicted as a queen wielding a gavel like a sword. Late-night comedians wasted no time either. Within hours, monologues opened with lines like, "So Judge Thomas fined Jasmine Crockett $500 million, and she paid him back with the receipts." Literally. The laughter was contagious, cathartic. For decades, Thomas had carried himself as untouchable, armored by his position and power. Now, his unraveling was the internet's latest comedy reel. But beyond the jokes, something heavier lingered. Celebrities joined in, some playfully, others gravely. Kerry Washington tweeted, "I don't usually watch court footage, but Jasmine Crockett is a masterclass in grace under fire." Raised fist medium dark skin tone fire hashtag Thomas exposed. Rapper Killer Mike posted, "That wasn't just a clapback. That was an exorcism." Even Oprah weighed in with a single word, accountability. Politicians split down predictable lines. Progressives hailed Crockett as a national hero, the face of a new generation unafraid to challenge the old guard. AOC posted a clip with the caption, "This is what speaking truth to power looks like." Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeted, "When you come armed with facts, no gavel can silence you." Conservatives, meanwhile, scrambled for footing. Some accused her of grandstanding. Others tried to downplay Thomas's visible breakdown as edited out of context. But the raw footage was undeniable. Millions had watched the cracks form in real time. And the people were choosing sides. Polls conducted within 48 hours showed Crockett's public approval surging. For many Americans, especially younger ones, the trial wasn't just about her. It was about them. About seeing someone stand tall in a room designed to make her small. About watching the untouchable finally be touched. Street murals appeared overnight in Atlanta, Houston, and Brooklyn, spray-painted portraits of Crockett holding papers like shields, a modern-day David with receipts instead of stones. College campuses hosted watch parties replaying her courtroom counterattack as though it were a championship game. Thomas, meanwhile, became the butt of the nation's jokes. His scowl was meme fodder, his gavel slam looped endlessly with captions like, "When Uno reverse hits too hard." Even editorial cartoons and traditionally conservative papers showed him sweating under a storm of documents while Crockett stood calm in the center. And yet, under the laughter and the memes, America felt something deeper. A crack in the old narrative. The moment had transcended comedy, transcended courtroom drama. In barbershops, living rooms, subway rides, people weren't just laughing, they were talking. About corruption. About accountability. About how one person's courage could puncture decades of untouchable power. For the first time in years, conversations about the judiciary weren't dry or distant. They were alive. Emotional. Urgent. And the public wasn't just consuming, it was engaging, demanding. As Crockett's team released a simple statement, "The fight is far from over," the nation buzzed with anticipation. What would come next? Would Thomas face investigation? Would others be pulled into the light? The hashtags swirled, the memes multiplied, the laughter echoed. But under it all, America's pulse shifted. And as the cameras followed Crockett leaving the courthouse, shoulders squared, head high, the cliffhanger was written in real time. Behind the laughter, America felt something deeper shifting, and it wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about what would come after her. The courtroom lights dimmed, the headlines began to quiet, but the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered far beyond the walls of justice. For days, America replayed her poise, her calm dismantling of power, her refusal to bend. And when she finally addressed the nation, she did not speak about the $500 million fine, nor about her victory over Judge Thomas. Instead, she reframed it in a single sentence. This was never about a fine. It was about dignity. In those words lay the true heart of the battle. Money could come and go. Titles could rise and fall. But dignity was the one currency that no gavel, no robe, no arrogant decree could strip away. Crockett made it clear that her fight was not simply her own. She had stood as a proxy for every teacher silenced at a school board meeting, every worker dismissed by a boss who thought himself untouchable, every citizen told to know their place. Her story was not about courtroom theatrics, it was about a truth older and deeper than law itself, that arrogance eventually collapses under the weight of truth. She told crowds gathered outside the courthouse, when someone tries to belittle you, when they weaponize their power to silence you, remember this, their arrogance is their weakness. Your composure is your strength. The lesson was simple yet profound. Justice, at its best, is not the property of elites or the inheritance of the powerful. It is not partisan, not left or right. Justice belongs to the people. And it breathes through the courage of those willing to stand, even when the cost is high. Her calm dismantling of Thomas's attacks had shown that raw fury can be frightening, but calm truth is unstoppable. For every slam of his gavel, she had responded with measured logic. For every insult, she had answered with dignity. And in the end, it wasn't his authority that defined the trial, it was her composure. The universal takeaway was clear: truth and composure defeat arrogance and corruption. Commentators compared it to a parable. David and Goliath rewritten for the modern age, not with a sling and stone, but with documents and dignity. Students began citing Crockett's trial in civics classes. Churches folded her story into sermons about integrity. Even workplaces invoked her name in meetings as a reminder that speaking calmly with evidence often carries more weight than shouting with power. Her rise became less about a single court case and more about a model of resistance. If she could stare down a judge who had spent decades cultivating an aura of invincibility, then ordinary people could push back against injustices in their own lives. They, too, could refuse to shrink when someone tried to tower over them. The moral crescendo came not in one fiery speech, but in the quiet power of Crockett's example. She showed that justice wasn't just written in books or decided in chambers. It lived in the choices of individuals, every citizen who decided not to be intimidated, every person who held onto their dignity when pressured to let it go. And so, as the noise of hashtags and memes faded into the background, what remained was a deeper sense of empowerment. The trial was not about Crockett alone. It was about the possibility that anyone, armed with truth, studying composure, could resist those who thought themselves above accountability. Her final public statement crystallized the lesson. No one can take your dignity unless you hand it to them. And when you stand in your truth, you do more than defend yourself, you remind this country what justice is supposed to look like. In that moment, she was no longer just a congresswoman or a courtroom victor. She became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that justice is an American value, not a partisan prize. And as the nation moved forward, the story carried its moral like a torch: you don't have to match arrogance with anger. You don't have to fight power with rage. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to stand calm, steady, and unshaken in the face of intimidation, and let truth do the rest. One fine. One courtroom. and America held its breath. From the moment Judge Thomas dropped that staggering $500 million penalty, the world thought Jasmine Crockett had been cornered. Yet, what unfolded wasn't a story of defeat, it was a reminder of what true leadership looks like when tested under fire. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. She didn't match arrogance with anger. Instead, she turned the weight of Thomas's authority against him by leaning on something far stronger: her composure, her dignity, and her unshakable command of truth. That, in the end, is why the courtroom flipped. Why whispers turned into cheers. Why the gavel that once seemed so absolute suddenly felt powerless. It wasn't because she had more money, or more connections, or even more time on her side. It was because she understood something most leaders forget: real power doesn't come from intimidation. Real power comes from composure. And that's the lesson this trial leaves behind, not just for politicians and judges, but for every single one of us watching. When arrogance tries to tower over you, when corruption tries to silence you, dignity can still win. So if this story moved you, if you believe dignity beats arrogance, share this story. Let it travel beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, into every space where power tries to bully truth into silence. And if you want more stories where courage silences the noise, where truth breaks through arrogance, and where real leadership shines when it matters most, then subscribe. Because this isn't just about one congresswoman in one courtroom. This is about the reminder that dignity, composure, and courage still have the power to change everything.